So on Wednesday this week, millions of Christians all over the world will hear some variation of "Remember you are dust, and to dust you shall return," as someone places an ashen cross on their foreheads as a way of marking Ash Wednesday, and a way of beginning the season of Lent. This has been the practice for many denominations for centuries. I don't know when it got started, but tradition has it that you burn last year's Palm Sunday fronds that are left over, and then you use those for Ash Wednesday the following year. That's the practice, at least how I've heard it. And it's a reminder of our mortality. Remembering that in Genesis it says God took the dirt and formed the dirt person, that's literally what Adam means in Hebrew, and then breathed into the dirt person breath of life. And that when we die, our bodies will be returned to that dirt from where we came. And I love the symbolism and the meaning behind that. I love the symbolism and meaning of Ash Wednesday. But when I was in seminary, a friend of mine really, y'all have friends that just can be a little bit too blunt, a little bit too crass, or have no tact. He's gotten better since then, but when I was in seminary, he said something that really sort of made me think very differently and critically about Ash Wednesday. The text that Amy read this morning, the gospel reading, is the one that's assigned to Ash Wednesday, or the recommended reading for Ash Wednesday. And he said, if Jesus said when you fast, brush your hair and do all your normal hygiene things and wash your face and don't look like you're fasting, if Jesus said to do that and we read that on Ash Wednesday, then why in the world do we put ashes on our face on Ash Wednesday so everyone knows that we're fasting on Ash Wednesday? Now, he was much more blunt than that. But can you imagine that happening after a very meaningful chapel service? A whole bunch of seminarians are like, oh, and he does that. It was very blunt. He was overly blunt, but he does, or did, and continues to make a good point. And I'm not sharing that point to say that we should not receive ashes on Ash Wednesday and that people who do are somehow wrong. I'm not saying that at all. It is a very meaningful thing for lots of folks, but it should be done with intention, with the right intention. It should not be done in order to be seen by others or to make a statement. It should not be done to be showy. It should be done because it's meaningful to the person receiving them. The Gospel of Matthew presents Jesus as the great moral and ethical teacher for the people of Israel and his followers. We could easily say that, like all philosophers, Matthew depicts Jesus as the person who teaches us how to live the good life. Good being defined various different ways by various different people and organizations and groups. But in this context, Jesus is the one who says, this is how you lead and live the good life as a follower of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And the Sermon on the Mount is Jesus' first big sermon, his first big teaching moment in Matthew. And it has been viewed as the center of Jesus' ethical teachings really since the Gospel of Matthew started to be circulated, I think in the middle of the 2nd century, maybe even early 1st century. I forget the dates of when Matthew was probably written down and circulated. And our reading for today is part of the Sermon on the Mount. It's actually sort of right in the middle of the Sermon on the Mount. This is part of the core of Jesus teaching his disciples, how do you live the good life? And in this section of the sermon, Jesus assumes that his followers are practicing their religion. He assumes they are giving to the poor. He assumes that we pray. He assumes that we fast and that we store up treasures. I've heard countless sermons where pastors are using this to make a case that we should do these things, but Jesus is assuming that we are doing these things. This is not, you ought do these things. This is, you are doing them. Here's how you do them best. He doesn't say this, and this is a little bit of a stretch, but it's not difficult to infer that Jesus is implying if you don't do these things the way that I'm telling you to do them, you might as well not do them. That's probably a bit overly blunt, just like my friend in seminary, but it's a safe inference. And because Jesus assumes that these are the things that we are doing, that we are practicing our religion, that we are giving to the poor, praying, fasting, and storing up treasures, and also because Katie and I were talking about, is there something we can do every Sunday in Lent to tie this season together? Just like our Advent candles, our Advent wreath ties that season together. We are going to be taking a moment each Sunday in Lent, which starts next week, not today, to look at each of these practices in turn and reflect on them, asking how have we done that particular practice in the last week, and how can we do it in the week ahead? So how does Jesus say that we ought to do these things when we do them? How do we be good disciples by doing these things the way that Jesus says to do? We fast, we give to the poor, we pray, and we store up treasures not to be seen or marveled at, but quietly and without fanfare, simply because they are the right things to do. When you pray, don't stand on the street corner with a megaphone. How many of us have ever sighed when we've heard that? Or said, I wish you wouldn't do that in this context. But pray in secret. When you fast, simply fast and don't make a show of it for the world to see so everyone feels pity for you. When you give to the poor, give to the poor. Don't make it a PR stunt. I really wonder what we would name buildings if we didn't have PR stunts happening all the time and it was just general generosity. In essence, Jesus says, do these things and don't be showy about it. Amy and I really enjoy watching the Great British Bake Off. Anyone else? Okay, baking show, British. It's like they all cooperate in this competition. As an American, it doesn't make sense, but it's lovely. And one of the regular critiques of the host of the show is they'll come up to a baker and say, every week your bakes look immaculate. They're wonderful. They're perfect works of art. And then they bite into it, and the flavor is just not there. Or the texture is wrong. And it's Paul Hollywood that says it. It's like this is style over substance. His critique is your substance does not match what the style of your baking is. That's kind of what Jesus is telling us to avoid doing. Jesus is saying substance over style. And that pairs very well with, remember you are dust, and to dust you shall return. Dust is dust. Dirt is dirt. It doesn't matter how stylish it is still dirt and dust. And that's good for us to remember. It's good to keep in mind because it helps us maintain good perspective. It helps us focus on substantive prayer and substantive generosity and helps us see that, or help us understand that being seen, it's not that important. Being thanked and acknowledged for what we do, yes, that is important, but doing it to be seen, much less important. When Amy and I were in New Zealand last fall, we visited their National Museum in Wellington. If you're ever in Wellington, go to the Te Papa. It is a great museum. Lots of memorable exhibits and just really well done. But one of the things that stood out to me the most throughout that entire museum that we walked through was a Maori quote at the beginning of the section on human history on those islands. What is given by the land should return to the land. And to me, that's a much more meaningful and substantive quote than, remember you are dust, and to dust you shall return. And it's more meaningful to me because it seems more actionable, more tangible. What is given by the land should return to the land. And if you know me, you probably know that that makes me think about compost. Thank you for laughing. Compost is garden gold. I love it. Some people are very active making their compost, and they go and turn it, and they do stuff all the time. I'm lazy, and I get beautiful compost by being lazy. There are many, many different ways of turning leftover organic matter and kitchen scraps into compost. And I have yet to see a single method of making compost that is showy. Like, I've seen big, grand things like the municipal way. Like, that's huge, but it's not showy. It's noticeable, but it ain't pretty. We do not make compost to be seen by others. We make compost to improve the land and return things to the land that gives us so much. Compost makes flowers more abundant. It holds on to moisture, so we spend less time watering, and if we're in the city, we spend less time worrying about our water bill going up. It increases the produce that comes from the land, and it reduces our carbon footprint. That's not even scratching the surface of everything that compost does. Just to say that compost is a very substantive thing. It is not showy, and it does great good all around. When Jesus says to do these things without being showy in Matthew 6 and the rest of the Sermon on the Mount, he is telling us to do them like we make compost, to be like compost in these things. Doesn't draw attention, and it's pretty mundane by itself, but when you make it and you use it correctly, when you do these things correctly, it has a beautiful effect all around it. Compost, by definition, is the definition almost of substance over style. But yet it does inevitably lead to some bit of showiness through beautiful flowers or an abundant produce or abundant harvest. And there are times when we cannot help but be showy when we do these things. I said earlier, I wonder what we would call buildings if we didn't name them after the people who funded them and got that bit of showiness. But honestly, if you donate enough money to a hospital to build a wing of the hospital, you can't help but be noticed doing that. And so long as there is substance, so long as the reason that it's done is not for show, our discipleship can be a little showy. It can have a little bit of flair. It's like Jimmy Carter building houses with Habitat for Humanity, or Dolly Parton sending books to children all over the world. Both of them do those things because of their faith, and they're honest about it, and they're pretty straightforward about it. And they get notoriety from doing those things. I think Jesus would be okay with both of those bits happening the way that they are because they are substantive things, not showy things. So when we cannot avoid being showy with our faith, when we fast or pray or give, when we can't avoid that, maybe we should be showy like a flower that's been fed some good compost. Flowers are not pretty all by themselves or for themselves only. They are pretty and they're showy to attract pollinators. Whatever insect has evolved to pollinate them. They are showy to get pollinated and produce some kind of fruit or nut or seed, but they're also showy for the benefit of the pollinators, like honeybees being the perfect example of they come and pollinate and take the pollen and the nectar and they make honey for themselves, and just their flowers are showy not just for themselves, but for so many other things around them. That style exists not just to be showy, but for the betterment and well-being of others. Substance over style, making good, beautiful compost. That's how we live life as followers of Jesus, the good life as followers of Jesus. That's how we store up treasures in heaven, not on earth where moth and rust destroy, but where bacteria breaks down and makes kitchen scraps beautiful garden gold. Being a disciple of Jesus is not about developing status or wealth or flair. It's not about being showy. It's about doing things of substance through prayer and generosity, not to be seen or to get something out of it, but because it's the right thing to do and it improves the world around us. So when you pray, when you fast, when you give, when you collect treasures, don't do it to be seen by others. Do it because it's the right thing, the Christ-like thing to do. Do it because it makes the world more abundant and more beautiful. Do it because it's your way of making compost for this world. And that's my I can't wait to start gardening sermon for today.